So you have technically beaten the angry space dwarf, Mr. L. Johnson, but I'm not going to lie, you've cut it a little bit closer than I might have expected. Hello and welcome back to Horsebets Tactics, where today we've got another big fighty character added to Warhammer 40K, so I thought we'd put him through his paces in a one-on-one showdown with each and every faction leader in Warhammer 40K. I've done a few of these contests before now. It is just going to be a damage contest for fun, working out the average damage that each model gets with one phase of psychic, shooting and melee, and seeing which character can cause the most percentage damage to the other one compared with their health. Obviously it's just for a bit of fun, it doesn't necessarily determine which model is best or anything. Quite a lot of these are pretty potent commanders, and a lot of their value is the buffs that they give other units rather than their personal combat stats. The foes that the line's going to be facing off against is every faction commander in Warhammer 40k for an army that has one. We don't have any named characters for the Harlequins, Chaos Knights or Genestealer cults, but I've included a few non-faction leaders where it made sense, like Drazhar for the Drukhari. Just for a few other interesting big bads in game as well, I thought I'd also fight him against the recently arrived Vashtorr, plus the Necron Nightbringer as well as the Silent King, as another common and scary choice that's very nasty against characters. The last one of these I did was with Angron. He carved through a fairly impressive tally, but such is the power of some of these fighters that he only killed 12 out of 10 of his opponents, and if you weighted things for points he only beats 10 out of 20 of them. Otherwise, for rules of the contest, any shooting is going to be counted at just within 12 inches. When they're in melee, they're both counted as charging, so get any buffs there. The models will get their warlord traits and any army-wide special rules like chapter tactics, and any permanent army-wide special rules that are in effect all game long. For this one, as with the rest though, we'll leave stratagems out of it. The characters here just have far too many options to decide which ones to go down. It's going to be basing it on pure stats and army rules. Here are the overall rules for Lionel Johnson, which I had talked about in the channel in a video recently. The recently awoken Primarch of the Dark Angels is a 320 point Lord of War. In general, he's got kind of similar stats to Rabute Guilliman, perhaps seeming to go a bit more down the raw melee might compared with the buffing abilities though. For his attacks, he first gets to strike with Armor Luminis, which has a plasma and a bolt shot profile, both of which he'll get to reroll ones to hit and wound with, as he has that with a passive buff that will affect characters. In melee, he strikes with Fealty, usually at strength 10, AP 5 and damage 4 with the strike mode, 11 attacks including shock assault, and again re-rolling ones to hit and wound, a lot of raw might. On the defensive, I must admit he is surprisingly lackluster, only 9 wounds at toughness 6 and a 4+ invul save. I was expecting the Emperor's Shield to do a bit more on the defensive side of things. As it is, it's good for a little bit of extra damage though. Every time he makes an unmodified saving throw of a 6, it reflects back 1 mortal wound. It's not huge, but I guess it helps out a little bit. Otherwise, he does have fights first, but it's not going to be relevant in the majority of these matches, as they're both counted as charging, so get fight first anyway. A fight's last rule would have been far more powerful. And finally, he does come with a couple of Deny the Witch rolls baked in. Those Watchers in the Dark each get a once per game denial. That will be pretty handy for fighting against certain psychers, particularly the Chaos ones where they get to re-roll it. So first up, let's try and take down the commanders of the Imperium then. I will start out with perhaps a particularly interesting fight, how he squares up against Rabute Guilliman, who very much feels like his equivalent. Similar sort of stat line, but fewer attacks. It makes a bit more sense to attack with the Hand of Dominion for the double strength and damage 4 against the Lion, and he has a few shooting attacks as well. Perhaps a major advantage as well is the Armour of Fate, getting a 3+ invul save and the chance to resurrect on death, particularly handy in these character duels. Let's see who's currently the mightiest Imperial Primarch in the 41st millennium. When engaged, the Lion gets to reroll ones to hit and wound. With Armor Luminis, he averages 1.5 wounds on Guilliman. The 3+ invul save is certainly very helpful, and does blunt his damage. With just the raw amount of attacks from Fealty, he gets 11 wounds out of that, and bouncing back some of Guilliman's own attacks, he gets an extra 0.8 mortal wounds on average through that. Overall, that averages 13 wounds against Guilliman's 9, but Guilliman is perhaps a little bit more complex a target to work things out against, as he's got the rule to stand up on a 4+ with d6 wounds remaining. It both means that just on average he'll have 10.75 wounds to chew through, so that I've upped it to that. And also, perhaps more worryingly for the Lion, it will give him a 50-50 chance to get to fight a second time, although on the second swing he'll almost certainly be brought down. In any case though, the Lion does put in a very strong showing, 123% damage dealt to Guilliman, but basically a 50-50 chance to try and kill him after one round of combat due to that resurrection mechanic. On the strike back, the Hand of Dominion averages about 2 wounds. And then it does seem that it's the way to go in melee as well, due to the extra damage it has, plus wounding on 2s. Kind of interesting that it comes out very similar to Fealty. Guilliman's damage is quite a lot less powerful, but the line just doesn't have very good defensive rules. Overall, that shakes out to 13.2 wounds initially, an extra 50-50 chance to fight again for an extra 6.5. So that averages almost 20 wounds compared with the line's 9, massively outcompeting the line for damage, 220% versus 123. Looks like it's a per point victory to Guilliman, as Guilliman costs a little bit less as well. In reality though, perhaps the bigger deal for winning the contest is the chance to resurrect and survive the line's onslaught. Looks like it's an Ultramarine victory in the Primarch versus Primarch fight. Moving on, let's take down a few High Lords of Terror. Next up, we've got Morvenn Vahl, the High Abbess of the Adeptus Sororitas. She's 280 points and has an upgraded Paragon Warsuit, and can give herself 4 rerolls to hit and wound with all of attacks, a 2-shot missile launcher, a Strength 6 heavy bolter, and the Lance of Illumination, a great big spear with Strength +3, AP 3, and Damage 3. The Warsuit has some nice defensive rules as well, Toughness 5 with 8 wounds, halving incoming damage and a 4+ invul save, and a shrug off against mortal wounds as well, which will be helpful against the Emperor's shield. Once per battle, she can also fight again at the end of the fight phase, but she would have to survive for that to take effect. Unfortunately for her, it seems like that is very unlikely indeed after one round in combat with the Lion. Armor Luminous doesn't really do all that much in the shooting phase, halving damage does cut that down quite a bit, but Fealty with the big damage 4 going down to damage 2 is really quite strong indeed, doing 10 wounds compared with Vahl's 8. And the Emperor's Shield has a small chance to bounce some back, despite Vahl having a mortal wound shrug off. Overall, it's 11 wounds to Vahl's 8, so a score of 139% damage to the Lion. On the fight back, Morvenn Vahl's missile launcher and heavy bolter actually do a surprising amount of work, doing 4.5 wounds in total given her 4 rerolls, and then the Lance of Illumination deals 7.5 wounds, though Morvenn Vahl isn't going to survive to fight again like this, so it looks like that's all she's getting. She's dealt 12 wounds compared with the Lion's 9, so effectively killed more points of Lion than she has taken herself, but slightly lower in the percentage damage calculation, 133% compared with 139. Just in terms of raw damage, the Lion wins this round, but if you wait for points, given that Morvenn Vahl costs 40 less, the per point victory does go to Morvenn Vahl, perhaps just a little bit surprising, seeing as she's a very equivalent model to Lionel Johnson in my opinion. A big important character with a bunch of buffs and also some okay combat as well. Victory to the Lion here individually, but a per point victory to Vahl. Next into the ring we have Trajann Valoris, Captain General of the Adeptus Custodes. He's 200 points and a pretty all-round threat once more. 8 wounds with a 4+ invul and a 5+ feel no pain type save on the defensive, and a meaty 6 attacks re-rolling the hit roll, all at strength 10, AP 3 and damage 3 with the Watcher's Axe. He does also have a rather nice rule with his Moment Shackle as well, where you can choose any one of a number of different combat debuffs. The best one for this duel is likely going to be the nullifying 1 attack from Fealty, which will reduce the Lion's damage output. Again, like Morvenn Vahl, he would ideally want to fight a second time, but he's not likely to survive to do that. When the Lion attacks Trajann Valoris, Fealty averages 11.7 wounds to him, that's after the feel no pain and 1 attack being completely nullified, but still he punches a whole load of attacks through his armour. Armor Luminous and the Emperor's Shield chip in for a little bit more. On average he gets just under 13 wounds compared with Trajann's 8, so striking down the Captain General. He's got a score of 161% damage there. On the fight back, the Watcher's Axe can chip 0.4 wounds in shooting, though in melee it does the main work, just over 6 wounds on average, so only 68% damage to the Lion. So in terms of a 1v1 victory, it is a victory to L. Johnson over Trajann here. However, once again, points just really aren't in the Lion's favour. Being a big 320 versus 200, it actually winds up being an 108% victory to Trajann per point. For the extra 120 points worth of value Trajann would have, he'd both have extra damage and extra defense, and it just edges out the Lion. It does seem to be a bit of a theme against the Imperial commanders, often managing to best them in single combat, but then losing per points due to his big 320 point price tag. Next up we've got Belissarius Cawl of the Adeptus Mechanicus, definitely a little bit less of a combat character as opposed to a leader. He's 160 points and has okay durability with toughness 6, a 2+ save and 8 wounds, plus he gets a 4+ invul and -1 damage with his Warlord trait. On the offensive, he strikes with a Solar Atomizer, a strength 10 damage 3 anti-tank gun, plus an Arc Scourge and some Mecha Dendrites, though the Arc Scourge only being damage 1 means that his combat potential is limited. When the Lion strikes, he perhaps does better against Cawl than most, 200% damage dealt here, 16 wounds dealt compared with 8, most of it being carried by Fealty of course. In return, Cawl hits back with a Solar Atomizer, dealing 1.7 wounds on average, and does a little bit more at 1.8 with the Scourge and the Mechadendrites, but overall, despite the Lion's perhaps lackluster defense, he still only manages 3.5 wounds out of 9, 39% damage overall. A big victory to the Lion one-on-one, and has actually finally got a per point win as well. Despite Cawl costing half his cost, it still works out as an 129% victory to the Lion per point. He's finally got a win there as well. Moving on, we've got a Supreme Commander of the Imperial Guard, Lord Solar Leontus. Fancy Bionic Horseman is just slightly north of half the Lion's points cost. His toughness 4 with a 3+ save and 4+ invul, and has a similar rule to Morvenn Vahl, halving incoming damage with his Refractor Helm. On the offensive, he's got a snazzy pistol called Soul's Righteous Gaze, and holds the Blade of Conquest, though again to the Imperial Guard he's certainly much more of a buffing character than a fighting one. On the offensive, Lord Solar is actually surprisingly hardy against the Lion's attacks. Fealty with its big damage 4 will get halved down to 2. Halving damage against damage 4 weapons is really quite a big deal and saves him quite a lot of pain. Overall, the Lion works out at almost 12 wounds, 146% damage to Lord Solar. On the strike back, Leontus shaves a couple of wounds with Soul's Righteous Gaze, obviously 2 wounds being average as it can only come in 3s, and Conquest deals an average of 2.5 wounds. That's around about half the Lion's health on average, or 160 points worth of Lion killed, 50% damage. Again though, per point, L. Johnson is pretty disappointed. Seems like in a direct contest, he's not even efficient enough to beat Lord Solar. When you essentially have almost 2 Lord Solars to fight the Lion, it averages out to being a slight victory to the Imperial Guard commander. Very embarrassing for a Primarch, I'm sure. Next up, we've got Kaldor Draigo, the Grandmaster of the Grey Knights. Again, he is around about half Lionel Johnson's cost, and he'll be striking with some rather nasty psychic powers, including Vortex of Doom, and the Titan Sword in combat at Strength 8 and Damage 3. As a Chapter Master, he'll also be re-rolling those attacks. On the defensive, he's got 7 wounds and a character and Terminator armor, and he's got a rare 3+ invul save in Warhammer 40K, given to him by Sanctum Sigillum, his Relic Shield. Despite big 3+ invul saves, the Lion still punches through his defences pretty nicely. Armor Luminis is perhaps more effective against him than most, not having any other arcane barriers besides that 3+ invul save, and then Fealty averages 14 wounds with Strike Mode. The Emperor's Shield mortal wounds are slightly reduced by his 5+ save against mortals, and overall L. Johnson deals 15.6 wounds to him, just under 200% damage. On the strike back, Kaldor Draigo averages just a little bit more than 1 wound with his mastercrafted Stormbolter. Vortex and Doom and Smite for some Witchfires do shave some wounds, though at 2.7 wounds on average it is actually far less than it would be if the Lion didn't have his 2 Watchers to deny, the first time that we've seen those in action. With 7 attacks re-rolling on the charge though due to his Warlord trait, the Titan Sword goes into work pretty nicely, almost 7 wounds on average, and it does wind up with 1 dead Lion. Even just 1-to-1, Draigo actually kills more points of Lion than the Lion does against Draigo, and combine that with the fact that Draigo is almost half the cost of the Lion, it's a pretty massive victory to the Grandmaster of the Grey Knights per point at 231. That's the best that we've seen so far in points efficiency, even beating out Guilliman. Next up, the Knight of the Dark Angels is going to be met by a Knight of a rather bigger nature. Canis Rex is the only unique character of the Imperial Knights. He's 440 points and has the stats of a Super Heavy, Toughness 8, 24 wounds, and a 3+ armor save. Sir Hector's Knightly Armor hits on Ballistic Skill and Weapon Skill 2+, gets a Las Impulsor for a whole bunch of high strength anti-tank shots, and then his relic combat weapon is called Freedom's Hand, 5 attacks at Strength 16 with exploding 6s, hitting on 2s with Strength ×2 and a big damage of 8. Pretty crazy stuff there, obviously meant for battling foes far bigger than a Primarch. He even has a special rule for Sir Hector to have a chance of getting out when the Knight Suit explodes as well, which could be key. Lionel Johnson doesn't sweat too hard though with the prospect of downing a super heavy walker. His stats are pretty well ideally set up for it, to be honest. 11 attacks re-rolling the 1s, all at AP -5 and damage 4. The Knight isn't going to get a save against it, and it's going to be wounding it on 3s. He averages 35 wounds in total, or 145% damage. On the strike back though, Canis Rex is taking no prisoners, almost 5 wounds on average from the Las Impulsor, and then the strike of Freedom's Hand is rather brutal, 21 wounds on average after those mortal wounds and the exploding 6s, and I've factored in the chance of him to use his single game reroll on that as well. Overall it adds up to one very squashed lion at 26 wounds compared with his 9, and Canis Rex does win the 1v1 fight here, 284% damage versus 145. Canis Rex is one of the opponents that does cost more points than the lion though, and actually per point it is incredibly close between the two fighters here, Canis Rex only just edging out the lion at 103%. Overall though, it is still a victory to Sir Hector, even if it's close, and I guess technically he would have the chance to get out if the knight doesn't explode, so if the two kill each other, then Sir Hector still has a technical chance of surviving via his ejector seat. Chaos characters next, and while the lion might not have met up against Abaddon the Despoiler in the recent conflict in the lore, he now gets a chance to try and turn the tables on the tabletop. It's going to be no small prospect though, the Despoiler costs more points than the lion, and has some pretty mad rules both in damage and defense. For damage, Dracnian strikes at a big strength 10, AP 4 and damage 3, rerolling all hits and wounds with the Despoiler's own innate rerolls. On the defensive, Abaddon's got one of those dreaded damage caps, not the thing that Fealty really wants to run into, plus a 4+ invul save, and both the marks of Tzeentch and Nurgle, meaning that he isn't wounded quite as easily, and he gets to nullify one attack per turn. When battle is joined, unfortunately Armor Luminous is kind of caught with the mark of Tzeentch. He's got a 43% chance at a failed save to break the mark of Tzeentch early, not that it really matters all that much, and just a very tiny chance of getting a wound through and dealing 2 wounds to the Despoiler, though it's ridiculously small in likelihood, and it only averages out to a 0.1 wound there. In combat, with the 11 attacks all at damage 4, the lion has got a very good chance to max out Abaddon's damage cap there. 2.9 wounds just with a very small chance of the Despoiler making all his saves, and the Emperor's Shield is kind of redundant, as if Fealty's already got a wound through, then he's already capped for that phase. Unfortunately, it's just 1/3 damage against the Despoiler. Much like Angron was when we did that contest, the lion just really doesn't like damage caps, with almost all of his damage being in a single fight phase attack. Abaddon's not taking any prisoners though. In return, the Talon of Horus does 2.2 wounds shooting, and then Dracnian does an enormous 11.6 wounds plus another 4 mortals. The 4 rerolls to hit and wound are rather brutal. Overall it's around about double the lion's damage, effortlessly winning the 1v1 fight, and the slight points disparity is nowhere near enough for the lion to catch up on Abaddon. Victory to Chaos here. Next into the ring, we're going to be fighting the lion against his 3 treacherous brothers, Mortarion, Magnus and Angron. Mortarion generally tends to do very well in these character contests. He's just got a pretty immense stat line both in terms of damage and defense, priced in at a mighty 450 points, but that gets him 7 attacks that he can reroll all the hits and wounds for, all at strength 16, AP 4 and damage D3 plus 3. His defense is perhaps the really standout bit though. He can take a Plague Warlord trait like the Gloaming Bloat to turn off enemy rerolls. He's got 18 wounds with a 4+ invul, and then yet more barriers to damage on top of that with -1 damage and a 5+ feel no pain. It takes an awful lot of damage to bring him down. He's even got psychic powers on top of that with a chance to do some mortal wounds or make him -1 to hit. The lion certainly struggles with all of these multiple damage modifiers. The Gloaming Bloat turning off rerolls is really quite big for him, seeing as he gets the ones to hit and to wound. There's about a 50% chance that he's going to be -1 to hit with the Miasma of Pestilence. After the lion's denial, it does make it a bit less likely. Armor Luminous and the Emperor's Shield chip in around about 1 wound on average, and Fealty only manages about 5 or 6. Overall, it works out to be just over a third of Mortarion's health, 36% damage killed off the Demon Primarch. In return, the Lion's Watchers do a fairly decent job of making Mortarion's spells a lot harder to cast. They get the reroll against Chaos, and that means that his Miasma is less likely to go off, and Smite is fairly unlikely as well. The Lantern chips in 1.3 wounds on average on top of that though, and Silence does the main work with a big damage D3 plus 3, around 16.5 wounds punched through on average. Overall again it's around about enough to kill the Lion twice over, and again the small points disparity isn't enough to allow him to catch up. A little bit less overwhelming than Abaddon per point at 289 versus like 450, but still a big win for the Demon Primarch whichever way you look at it. Moving on, we've got his Tzeentchian brother Magnus the Red, Demon Primarch of the Thousand Suns, 420 points in game, and while he certainly doesn't have the raw durability of Mortarion, he brings a ridiculous amount of psychic damage to the table. On the defensive, he's toughness 7, 18 wounds with a 4+ invul once more, and he gets -1 damage, though not the failed no pain. On the attack, he'll strike with the Blade of Magnus, again strength 16 and 8 attacks, though only damage 3 this time. A lot of his damage and utility is slanted towards his psychic abilities, which he has access to every single one of the Tzeentch discipline, and even the Lion's going to find it hard to deny these, as he gets a +2 to cast, and has the awesome power of the Gaze of Magnus Smite. When battle is joined, Magnus does have an 87% chance to get the -1 to hit spell off, even after the Lion's rerollable denial. Rerolling and the +2 to cast are rather good. Still though, without turning off rerolls and things, the Lion does significantly more damage against him. Fealty deals around about 10 wounds, and after the pistol and the Emperor's Shield bounce back, is around about 12 wounds out of 18, 68% damage. On the offensive, as well as the -1 to hit, Magnus casts Twist of Fate as well, a very good chance to get Ignore Invuls on the Lion, which will be very important for the Blade of Magnus to deal a whole bunch of damage to him. He also goes for his boosted smite as well. After denials it works out to be about 3 wounds, and then the Blade of Magnus, with the good chance of ignoring Invuls, deals 15 wounds on average. He'll be saving on a 6+ most of the time. Again, like the last couple of Chaos contenders, he roundabout doubles out the Lion's defense there, 18 wounds rather than 9, and a big victory to Magnus individually. On a per points weighted basis though, it is considerably closer, only 168% victory to Magnus per point. He does cost a fair amount more, but it's still pretty convincing. Lastly of the Demon Primarchs, we have Angron, Primarch of Khorne. He's 360 points, will be able to reroll his attacks with one of his aura buffs, and with the World Eater's Chapter tactic he'll be wounding on 2s and striking with a brutal 13 attacks, all at damage D3 +3. Absolutely enormous melee power there. Like the Lion though, he doesn't really have all that many barriers to damage. He does have 18 wounds, but he's only toughness 7 and a 4+ invul. The Lion should be able to do a decent amount of combat damage. As a result, Armor Luminous and the Emperor's Shield do actually do a fair amount of work. This is actually the highest amount of damage that the Emperor's Shield ever reflects, just due to the obscene amount of wounds that Angron will inflict. 1.7 wounds bounced back on average. Perhaps appropriate enough given the Lion's desire to smash the demon's head in with that Emperor's Shield in the recent lore. Still though, Fealty does the vast majority of the work once more, nothing too much to stop it from reaching its full potential there. 106% damage dealt, 19 wounds compared with Angron's 18. On the return though, just the sheer weight of attacks and enormous damage D3 +3 massively cuts down the line. Samniarius and Spinegrander strike with 26 wounds on average, almost tripling out the Lion's defense there. Certainly no major damage barrier to killing him. The points disparity does even things up just a tiny bit, but still it's a 214% victory to Angron per point. Victory to the Demon Primarch both individually and in efficiency. The news isn't getting any better with the arrival of Be'lakor, fresh from backstabbing Vashtorr in a big way. The original Demon Prince of Chaos Undivided weighs in at 420 points these days and strikes with the Blade of Shadows, 6 attacks that ignore invuls, all at strength 12, AP 4 and a big damage D3 +3. It means that the Lion will only be saving on a 6 against that, with his normal Primarch invul save useless. Be'lakor gets rather a lot of defensive barriers of his own though. He's got his Demon Invul save of a 4+, but then beyond that he also turns off hit rerolls. The Lion will be -1 to hit and to wound against him, and at range he'll reduce the Armor Luminous damage down to 1 as he's got a -1 damage there. It's hard to kill the Lord of Shadows. In combat the Lion gets reroll 1s to wound only, -1 to hit and wound, and that really impedes his damage all over the place. Fealty only averages just slightly more than 2 failed saves, and the Emperor's Shield maybe contributes just a little bit more than normal, with mortal wounds being pretty good to try and kill Be'lakor with. Overall it's just under 9 wounds out of Be'lakor's 20, 180 points worth of damage dealt there. In return Be'lakor tries with some Psychic, with Void Slivers and Smite for some mortal wounds. With the Lion's rerollable denies though, they have quite a low output. It doesn't really need it all that much though given the Blade of Shadows. Again an average damage output of almost double what the Lion has, saving on a 6+ just isn't very reliable. Overall he adds up to 206% damage compared with the Lion's 43, a 278% victory to Be'lakor per point as well. The Lion can't quite shape up against this eldritch horror it would seem. Next up we'll see how the new Chaos Demigod on the block can fare. Vashtorr the Archivane costs 260 points to field in-game, and I think it's safe to say that his datasheet was seen as a tiny bit underwhelming compared with what people were hoping for him. He's certainly a long way off Be'lakor to be honest. On the defensive is only 14 wounds, a 2+ armor save and 4+ invul, with -1 damage for his Body of Unholy Artifice. On the offensive, he's got a small flamethrower attack, and then he strikes with Vashtorr's hammer. Strength 14, AP -2, and a flat damage of 3. It'll be a lot better against vehicles, though that's not going to be relevant against the lion. When battle is joined, it seems that the lion can do exactly what he needs to take down the Soulforged King. Just under a wound on average from his pistol, the same for the Emperor's shield, and fealty does just over 12. Overall, it averages a rather neat 14 wounds of Vashtorr's 14, 100% of the Archiphane's wounds removed. In return, Vashtorr's claw isn't particularly effective, wounding on a 5+ and saving on a 4, but any hits that he gets through with his hammer are felt massively. He averages between 1 and 2 hits unsaved, and between all that he doesn't quite net himself a dead lion, 8 wounds out of 9 on average, 280 points dealt. Overall, on a model per model basis, it's 100% plays 80 for the lion versus Vashtorr. A victory for the lion here, but if you do wait for points, unfortunately it is the Archiphan who wins once more. When accounting for the 60-point disparity, it winds up being an 131% victory for Vashtorr the Archiphan. I must admit, through quite a lot of these, the lion's point disparity really doesn't help him. Finally, let's see how the lion fares against the champions of Xenos, and first into the ring we have the Avatar of Khaine, everyone's favourite demigod to show that their character is very powerful against when they fight in the lore. In game, the Avatar's 280 points and is rather hard to take down, toughness 8 and halves damage, which isn't exactly the best thing for the lion's attacks. I feel like that damage 4 is just extra nasty for the halving rule compared with anyone who strikes with D3+3 or 3. In combat, the Avatar strikes with a Wailing Doom, a piercing strike with 7 attacks at strength 14, AP 5, and a huge damage D6+2, plus he gets a similar sort of attack at shooting. In combat, the lion can muster 9 wounds of the Avatar's 14, a fairly solid 65% damage dealt there, but the Avatar just has a lot more raw might than him, an average of 2 wounds burnt off by the Wailing Doom in shooting, and then run through at a big 13.3 wounds on average in combat. Overall, it's 169% damage versus the lion's 65. It only gets worse when you consider that the Avatar is less points than the lion. He is pretty much a dedicated combat character without buffs though, but still a 340% victory for the Avatar is pretty enormous. I thought it would also be interesting to try them against the Yncarne, the Avatar of the Eldar God of Death. Iniad's manifestation is 260 points, a little bit less raw might than the Avatar of Khaine, only toughness 7 and 12 wounds, but still gets that half damage rule, some rather good psychic powers, a minor shooting attack with a swirling soul energy, and his piercing strike allows him to ignore imball saves with damage D3+3. It's going to be Be'lakor all over again here. In combat, the lion does a fair bit better against the Yncarne given the reduced wounds, slightly higher damage coming here from the pistol, almost 10 wounds dealt of the Yncarne's 12. But on the strike back, the Yncarne has him fairly comfortably beaten. Smite does around about 1 wound after denials, and then after that the Yncarne goes for Ancestor's Grace, a chance for +1 to wound, and to be wounding the lion on a 2+. The Swirling Soul Energy chips another couple of wounds, and then the Sword of Souls does the majority of the work, 15 wounds ignoring those invul saves, only saving on a 6 for the lion. In the straight fight, it's 81% damage plays 188, and per point it's a massive 350% victory to the Yncarne, beating the lion by quite a large margin and also costing far less points. Having a bit of trouble fighting some Shards of Gods, L. Johnson can try and go and pick on a Drukhari character now. Seeing as they still don't have Asdrubal Vex, we'll go for Drazhar, the Drukhari Incubi champion, 145 points, and some rather brutal melee attacks with 4 rerolls to hit and wound with his Warlord trait, a +1 to wound, and then a flurry of 5 attacks with the Executioner's Demiclaves, strength 6, AP 3, and damage 3. He will get to fight again an additional time in the fight phase if he survives to do so, as all the initial attacks happen simultaneously though, again it's kind of unlikely. On the defensive is not too bad for an Eldar, but is only 6 wounds at a 2+ save and a 4+ invul, and -1 damage. As a result, without particularly hard defensive stats to overcome, the lion just does an enormous amount of damage there, a pretty huge 17 wounds compared with Drazhar's 6, or 281% damage overall. For his part, Drazhar actually has a very tiny chance to make the lion fight last due to his Tormentor's rule. If he does so, he's got around about a 70% chance to get the early kill on the lion, as he would get to fight twice before the lion would get to strike at all. Overall, it adds up to a tiny 2% chance to KO the lion before they even get to fight, but otherwise it's just going to be battle as joined as per normal. With all those rerolls and attacks, the Executioner's Demiclaves get around about 6 or 7 wounds per fight phase. If he fights twice, I guess that would be 11 wounds, but he's very much not likely to do so with the huge amount of damage that the Lion can inflict the first time. Overall, he doesn't quite kill the Lion in one round of fighting, though does take down a very meaty amount of points. For percentage damage, it's 281 plays 72. But given that Drazhar is less than half the points cost of the Lion, it actually works out to be 125% victory to Drazhar per point, as if your weight per point is effectively going to have over double the damage and double the defense. It does seem that while the Lion might fairly easily be able to squash these smaller characters, he still doesn't seem to be more efficient than them, perhaps mainly due to his own poor defensive rules allowing them to take such a big chunk out of him. Next up, and to properly test the Lion's monster slaying credentials, we have the Swarmlord, the big bad Tyranid Hive Commander with the 4 bone swords, and he's got some fairly meaty stats in their latest codex: 13 wounds at toughness 8 with a 2+ save and a 4+ invul, plus his blade parry rule is particularly handy, reducing a failed save to 0 once per fight phase. He'll also have at least some chance of getting a 5+ feel no pain from Catalyst, and on the offensive he strikes out with those bone sabers, 9 attacks at AP 4 and damage 3. In combat, the Lion does have to contend with Catalyst, slightly reducing his damage output, though for the most part his attacks do have quite a good profile for dealing with the Swarmlord. Fealty averages 10 wounds in melee, 1 failed save gets blocked by the Swarmlord's blade parry, and overall the Lion averages 11 wounds out of the Swarmlord's 13, or 85% damage. On the Swarmlord's part, he'll go for Catalyst and Smites. Catalyst only has around about a 50% chance to go off with the Lion's Denial. A 5+ feel no pain is pretty handy though if it does, and Smite will ship 1 wound on average, again the Lion's Denial reducing that by quite a bit. Then the Swarmlord goes in with the Bone Sabers, averaging 8 wounds there, and overall it's 9 wounds of 9 from the Lion, just neatly enough to kill him perfectly. Overall in a 1-1 fight it's actually remarkably close. The Swarmlord only slightly beats the Lion here at 100 versus 85. But of course on a per point level, the Swarmlord is significantly less than the Lion, 240 plays 320, that'll add up to almost a 210% victory to the Swarmlord point for point. From Beast of the Tyranids to Beast of the Orcs, next we have Ghazghkull. The warboss of Armageddon weighs in at 300 points, and again he's going to be making the Lion a bit sad as he's got some damage caps, 12 wounds with a 4+ invul save, but most importantly he can't take more than 4 wounds in a single phase, so basically a single attack of fealty is going to go through and no more. His damage is going to see no such problems though, 5 attacks and essentially 6 with the Warlord trait, exploding 6s with Goths, and all made with Gork's Claw at strength 14, AP 4 and damage 4. He's certainly ready to wreck some face with that. He's also got 16 shots from Mork's Roar, his big shooter as well, if he can hit with any of them. As expected, the damage cap does really hinder the Lion quite a lot. Armor Luminous is actually really quite relevant in this matchup, dealing 1.3 wounds on average. Fealty is almost guaranteed to get that 4 wounds through though. Ghazghkull only needs to fail 1 save, but then he can't take any more damage that phase, so the Emperor's Shield isn't relevant. Overall it's an average output of 5.3 wounds versus Ghazghkull's 12, only 44% damage there. In return, Ghazghkull can chip off a little bit with Mork's Roar at 0.6 wounds. Gork's Claw does most of the work though, with almost 15 wounds dealt to the poor Lion, around about 1.5 times his damage overall, 169% damage plays 44. Once more, the points differential isn't in the Lion's favour either, it's only going to make it worse. Point for point, Ghazghkull wins this fight with a 437% victory. Next up, let's try and pick on the little guys, with the Lion versus Uthar the Destined, a High Carl of the Great Arthurian League of the Leagues of Votann. Uthar is 160 points and is actually surprisingly strong for a single Space Dwarf. He'll be able to throw out a Judgment token on the Lion, and with his Great Arthurian League rules that means he will auto wound him on a 5+ with each of his attacks. He's got the chance for some mortal wounds with his Vulcanite Disintegrator, and then again in combat with the Blade of the Ancestors. He'll be able to reroll those hits as well due to his High Carl rerolls. Certainly ups the chance of him getting a fair few mortal wounds out of those attacks, both at range and in melee. Though perhaps one of the single most problematic rules for the Lion is his defensive one. He may only have 6 wounds, but every time he takes damage he reduces the damage output of that attack to 1, so the Lion isn't going to be able to get damage 4 attacks against him, and it actually makes more sense for him to use the sweep mode of his sword attacks rather than strike. Finally, he's also got Ancestral Fortune, allowing him to change a single throw to a 6, either for a bit of damage or defense. Despite really quite a lot of barriers to damage though, the Lion is still strong enough to take down Uthar in a single round of combat. He'll only get his reroll ones to hit this time due to Void Armor, and Void Armor also worsens the gun AP of Armor Luminis as well, down to AP 0 for the Bolter profile. Even with switching to a big 22 attacks with Sweep mode, Fealty will only penetrate the armor with 7 of those, but overall that is still enough to take down the doughty Space Dwarf. 8 wounds dealt compared with the 6, 133% damage. In return though, Uthar's attacks are surprisingly potent, mainly because he's got the chance for a whole bunch of mortal wounds. The Vulcanite Disintegrator does 1.1, and then the Blade of the Ancestors actually averages around about 7 wounds against the targets, partly due to him punching in an automatic 6 to hit, which when you've got a Judgment token converts straight away to 3 mortal wounds with his blade profile, and he averages very nearly offing a Primarch, despite only costing about half the points. Overall it's a close win to Lionel Johnson in a 1-1, but a massive win to Uthar as he costs so little. Again, maybe this isn't the Primarch of the Dark Angels' most finest hour. Next up we have the Tau, and as with the Angron contest, I thought we'd let Farsight take the reins here. He is a bit more appropriate character to be leading a fight than either Ornvar or Shadowsun, I think. At least he can do a little bit of combat, and he's had some fun lore and a nice new model recently as well. Farsight's the very cheapest out of any of the characters that are fighting today, only 130 points, but given that his stats really aren't too bad, 5 attacks hitting at strength 10 and damage 3 with the Dawnblade, plus a couple of shots with a high intensity plasma rifle, strength 8 and damage 3. He isn't really all that hard to take down with only toughness 5, a 4+ invul from his shield generator, but still for the points cost he isn't too bad. Perhaps as expected, the Lion does not have too much trouble running through Farsight. Armor Luminis chips in even more than normal, and then Fealty averages a pretty whopping 21 wounds more or less. Overall he's got enough damage output to just about kill Commander Farsight 3 times over. In return, Commander Farsight does put in a good effort. The Plasma Rifle does about 1.7 wounds, the Dawnblade 4.2, so overall he chips around about 2/3 of the Lion's health off, but still nowhere near whatsoever in a one-on-one conflict. The Lion effortlessly wins the 1v1, perhaps as expected, though again perhaps more unexpected is that if you actually wait for points again, Farsight comes out as very slightly ahead. Basically, if you have about 2.5 Farsights fighting the Lion, then he's going to kill about 500 points worth of Lion defense, where the Lion only kills 420 points worth of Farsights. I must admit it is just a little bit surprising to see a Tau commander being more efficient than the Lion in combat. Lastly, for the Xenos, we have the Necrons, and I thought we'd put both the Silent King and the Nightbringer into the ring on this one. The Nightbringer does feel like quite a fun one to throw into these contests, just because of how powerful he is against characters. As the Necron Supreme Commander, the Silent King does have a pretty enormous datasheet, 400 points in his current incarnation, and he's got quite a lot going on. 2 enormous damage 6 attacks from those Annihilator beams from the Minears, a whole bunch of smaller shots from the staffs of the Triarch, and then in combat 3 different melee profiles to go at the Lion with, the Scythe Staff and the Scepter. He's got pretty massive defense with 26 wounds and a 4+ invul as well, and the Minears are particularly annoying for characters to have to deal with, as basically they've got the big chance to overkill them and absorb attacks that are far more powerful than they're really worth. Finally, and perhaps the single worst news for the Lion, is that the Silent King has a Fight's Last rule with his obeisance generators, and as per this conflict, both characters count as charging, and that would actually mean that even though the Lion has a Fight's First rule, it would counter out to the Silent King getting to strike before the Lion. Really not exactly good news when he's not got enormous defense to start with. Overall, presuming the Lion did actually live to swing, Armor Luminis is actually likely to punch through 1 failed save just about, and that is actually quite important for trying to deal with those Minears, as it means that they'll absorb 1 less attack from Fealty. Still though, there is a big amount of overkill into the Minears, and between Armor Luminis, Fealty and the Emperor's Shield, it still only averages out to 17 wounds of the Silent King's 26. Zarek only takes 64% damage. The returning strikes, though, are rather brutal both in shooting and in combat. The Annihilator beams have got a pretty reasonable chance of getting a failed save through, just under 5 wounds on average, obviously in a multiple of 6. The Scepter averages 2.3 wounds and the Staff 2. Zarek actually has a very high chance of actually just killing the lion before they even get to fight, though if he does, he'll average about another 8 wounds or so once more with the 3 attacks in combat. Overall, his 17 wounds versus the lion's 9, 191% damage, and winning the fight regardless of whether or not the lion gets to strike. Per point, despite costing a fair bit more, it would still be an 194% victory to the Silent King. Though honestly, realistically, the lion dies before he gets to swing for multiple different reasons, a very high chance to die for shooting, and then if they both count as charging, which is generally what I've counted for the rest of these contests, Zarek's fight last rule will mean that the lion gets to strike last, so if we're following these rules of the contest to the letter, he'd actually only get his pistol damage overall and not fealty. However you slice it though, it's a very convincing win for Zarek. Lastly, as if the lion hasn't quite endured enough pain throughout all these contests, let's send him off against one more god of death. The Catan Shard of the Nightbringer costs 320 points, the same as the lion, and he's just about bad news for any character in Warhammer 40k. On the offensive, he breaks through most natural barriers with his entropic blow from his scythe, 6 attacks with strength 14, AP -4 and damage d6, punching straight through invul saves, and any other rules that prevent the model from taking damage. He's also got some Catan powers to punch through a bunch of mortal wounds, and on the defensive he's got one of those damage caps once more. He can't take more than 3 wounds at any one phase, and at the start of each of his turns he regrows a wound as well to add insult to injury. On the offensive, the lion's armor luminous is more important than most once more, again dealing 1.5 wounds on average, and actually doing about half the work as Fealty does, as Fealty just rams up straight against that damage cap and almost guarantees itself 3 wounds. Then, seeing as the Nightbringer survives, I've given him an extra half a wound back, as he gets to regenerate 1 wound every 2 turns. Overall it's 4 wounds out of 9, so has dealt about 44% damage to the Nightbringer. Not enough really to seriously threaten the Star God. In return though, the Nightbringer is willing to take another life. His mortal wound output is rather brutal, with Antimatter Meteor and Gaze of Death averaging a pretty nasty 5.3 mortal wounds on average, and that's all before the scythe of the Nightbringer gets to work, averaging 12.1 wounds, ignoring the lion's invul saves, and overall almost killing him twice. With no change in the points between them, it's just a 434% victory to the Nightbringer. Again, not exactly the particular model that you really want to run up against if you're a character. Overall, I must admit it perhaps hasn't been the best showing for the lion out of these. Out of all the challengers that he's fought against, he's only beaten 9 out of 22 of them, less than half of the list. He didn't beat anyone that cost more points than him, and the greatest 2 foes that he took down in terms of points cost were Morvenn Vahl and Vashtorr. Perhaps the single most horrendous statistic out of all of this though is that if you weight per points, it looks like the only faction leader that he actually came out on top against was Belissarius Cawl for various different reasons. While he might have beaten all of the others on this list, it looks like the points differential actually has them come out slightly ahead. This really does look like Games Workshop have probably made the lion significantly overcosted, to be honest, given that perhaps he doesn't have quite as much good command abilities as Reboot Guilliman himself. He's supposed to be a little bit more combat orientated, but perhaps partly due to his defensive profile, it looks like in any straight fight he's at a significant disadvantage. Here's the table of faction leaders and other notables that he fought against, all the characters that beat the lion per point, starting with the best and going down to the least. It looks like, as with quite a few of these character contests, the ones with the damage caps come out significantly on top. Abaddon, Ghazghkull and Nightbringer all head up this table, and then actually the next 2 per point with the Yncarne and Avatar of Khaine. I guess they're both just particularly good at dealing with him with their halving damage. It's kind of surprising that Uthar the Destined and Kaldor Draigo are quite so high on this list. I guess it's just a whole load of mortal wounds that mean that they can really put the lion down surprisingly easy. For closer fights, the lion was only just ahead of a whole bunch of commanders who he managed to actually kill. The closest fights that he lost per point were Lord Solar, Trajann Valoris and Canis Rex, even though Canis did have a chance of escaping afterwards. Overall, it really just does seem that while the lion might be able to off smaller characters with relative ease, if you do put him up against his peers in Warhammer 40k, he is going to have trouble with doing things that really justify his points cost. His combat stats are really quite impressive, but is let down with being fairly easy to kill. and I'd argue that he probably doesn't have the amount of buffs or the speed to get across the table to really justify this kind of level of weakness in defense. As with Angron, just having simple melee without mortal wounds, ignores invulns or ignores damage caps does kind of hurt him in character fights, though Angron just with his raw might did do a lot better. He got 12 out of 20 of the victories that he fought against, and he won 10 of the fights per point, even though he lacked his respawning and blood tithe benefits. Overall, kind of disappointing that he isn't a little bit more mid-tier. Not the best considering that he's supposed to be a fairly famed blade master. Hopefully the 10th edition rules will be a bit kinder to Lionel Johnson. So anyway, let me know what you think of the fights down in the comments below. Did this go the way that you'd expect it to? I must admit I was expecting him to get a little bit better in terms of per point value against a lot of things. I did find it surprising that while he beats a lot of lesser characters, they actually do more damage into him than he does to them, point for point. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, where I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming, and if you would like something similar to watch, then I'll link the video where we put Angron through his paces down in the video description. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel and you'd like to help support the creation of new ones, then I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page, and you can find that linked in the video description below. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.